There is a divide in cognitive science, and the study of esotericism may have something to say about it. To illustrate this divide, we can compare two articles in the 2017 Aries special issue exploring cognitive science within the study of esotericism. The first is by Egil Aspram, who examines the imaginations of modern magicians through the lens of computational neuroscience. He employs a theory called predictive processing, which views cognition as a kind of computer within the brain that represents and predicts the environment, thus guiding one's actions. He uses this theory to explain the mental imagery created by the visualization practices of magicians, describing them as simulated perceptions which can be stabilized through repeated practice. This approach represents the computationalist view of cognition, where cognition is centered in the brain and interacts with the world through internal representations. April Laconic's exploration of Gnostic soul flights, on the other hand, utilizes a quite different approach. Referred to as 4E cognition, this approach does not locate cognition exclusively in the brain, but rather views it as embodied in an organism, embedded in a socio-environmental context, enacted through engagements with the world, and extended into the world. Although these two views often conflict, they both offer unique contributions to understanding both cognition and esotericism. In particular, Tectonic utilizes conceptual metaphor theory, an early 4E approach introduced by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. This views metaphor not as mere linguistic embellishment, but as a fundamental aspect of cognition, with the theory stating that abstract concepts are grounded in our embodied sensory motor experience. This utilization of knowledge from one conceptual domain to navigate another enables a kind of imaginative rationality, which allows one to blend various concepts through the medium of their embodied experience. To illustrate, if I ask, did you grasp that idea? I am relying on the source domain of your concrete experience of perceiving, possessing, and manipulating objects while physically grasping them in order to communicate the abstract target concept of transferring an idea. Therefore, when I describe abstract ideas with phrases like higher learning, down to earth, or politically left or right, I'm utilizing spatial understanding gained from moving my body in the world and mapping it onto a more abstract domain. It is through this that Deconic explores how abstract ideas in Gnostic texts like the soul's journey are grounded in embodied spatial metaphors. Yet, the use of conceptual metaphors to illustrate the importance of the body is not exclusive to language. Religious texts and practices are teeming with conceptual metaphors to help grasp their ideas. A common example can be found in the communion ritual of Catholicism, with its bread and wine illustrating the centrality of the embodiment of Christ. This ritual utilizes the familiar concrete source domain of eating and drinking to convey the abstract concept of sacrifice of and union with Christ by using the metaphorical medium of the bread and wine. The communion ritual illustrates that conceptual metaphors may extend into the world through objects like bread, wine, and books. This extended conception of cognition was proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers with their extended mind theory, which states that cognitive processes may extend into the world through tools and representations. They claim that a cognitive process like remembering an address or date need not be confined to neuronal activity in the brain, but may properly be said to include external objects like notebooks and phones. Thus, when one is taking notes, they are quite literally extending their memory into the material notebook through the symbolic representations of the written words. Nevertheless, these notes only count as cognitive if they are read and internally represented by a cognitive agent. Therefore, while this theory extends traditionally conceived brain-based borders of cognition, a strict divide remains between different kinds of representations present in the neuronal activity of the organism and at the level of symbolic representations in the external environment. This theory states that representations within the mind correspond to the representations within the world and thus can serve the extended cognitive function, but these are fundamentally different types of representations. This strict divide between internal and external space, and the reliance on the correspondence of representations, makes this theory heavily compatible with the computationalist approach exemplified by Aspram's exploration. Returning to the communion ritual, we can observe not only an extension of conceptual metaphors into bread and wine, but also an active participation in them through the act of eating and drinking. An act which, by definition, breaches the aforementioned border of consuming organism and consumed environment. When one performs this ritual act, they illustrate that conceptual metaphors can be enacted through performances which blur the boundary between externality and internality. This illustrates another significant theory within 4E cognition, enactive sense-making. Introduced by Francisco Varela in his groundbreaking book, The Embodied Mind, this theory proposes that cognition does not arise within the organism, but instead emerges in the dynamic interactions between organism and environment. Rather than the world being pre-given and represented within the organism, this theory proposes that organisms enact their world or Umwelt into being. Therefore, the sense an organism makes of its environment is not passively received, but rather actively formed through mutual engagement. Grounded in the biological concept of autopoiesis, this theory suggests a more porous boundary between organism and environment, depicting the structure of each as coupled and co-defining. Consequently, meaning and identity arise through interaction in a way where boundaries are not as strict as described in the previous approach. A clear example of this can be found in the mutual shaping of the beaks of hummingbirds and the flowers they pollinate evolved specifically to fit each other. Here, the structure of the organisms is not determined by individual agents, but rather emerges through the mutually shaping action of the pollination. Turning to the cognitive realm, this implies that meaning and identity, and thus representation, emerge through dynamic, embodied action in the world. In short, we make sense of ourselves and the world through an interaction which blurs the boundary between the two. This brief introduction to some of the diverse approaches in cognitive science has elucidated the divide exemplified by Aspram and DeConnick's articles. On one end, we have extended mind, with its reliance on a strict distinction between a microcosm of representations internal to the organism and a macrocosm of representations in the external world. On the other, we have enactive sense-making, with its porous boundary between organism and environment, in which worlds and their representations emerge from active engagement. With this in mind, we will now turn to a magical practice which straddles the threshold between these, and may potentially act as an example of how these approaches need not necessarily conflict. The fourth of the E's states that cognition is embedded in sociocultural environments, and this leads to 4E's deep engagement with scholars across the humanities. Being entangled with a history of actions and concepts, cognitive processes and practices are inherently intertwined with the context in which they take place, arising through dynamic engagements between this context and the agents that inhabit it. An example of this embedded temporal development can be found in the evolution of thought through the medium of text. Through the historical process of reading, interpreting, commenting, and writing new texts, concepts and cognitive practices are transmitted and transformed. This can be clearly seen in the combinatory remixing of esoteric ideas by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret magical order which began in London in 1888. This short-lived group utilized a wide range of esoteric currents embedded within the library-filled cultural context of their time, incorporating various sources on magic, alchemy, astrology, Kabbalah, and Rosicrucianism, just to name a few. Although their systematizing tendencies steamrolled over much of the intricate detail of these diverse sources, their quest for commonality did reveal some recurring themes, key amongst them being the four classical elements. Through the creation of practices derived from these various esoteric currents, members such as W.B. Yeats or Aleister Crowley were offered techniques of engaging concepts embedded in these texts through the lived experience of ritual. Given the bewildering amount of material produced by the Golden Dawn, we must confine our focus to a simple but foundational practice called the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, which engages the four classical elements along with a fifth element of spirit which unites these. Here, the pentagram acts as a conceptual metaphor which distills various concepts associated with the elements embedded in text into a single geometric representation. Yet, as we saw in the communion ritual, conceptual metaphors can be extended and enacted as a means of bridging understanding into the realm of embodied experience, and this is precisely what the LBRP achieves. To understand this, we must examine how the pentagram is conceptualized in the Golden Dawn. Within the writings of its members, the elements are perceived as composing both the microcosm of the embodied magician as well as the macrocosm of the external environment, and thus are considered to reflect each other. Subsequently, both the body and the elements are corresponded with the pentagram, whose four lower points represent the four elements in the limbs, and the top point representing spirit and the head. Therefore, we have a situation where the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, as well as the pentagram reflecting both the body and the elements. To observe this idea's significance to the LBRP, we can look to Aleister Crowley's claim in his text Liber ABA that there is a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. It is the uniting of the microcosm with the macrocosm, and that these extend, but always maintain their mutual relation. Following this, we can understand a primary purpose of the LBRP is communicating the connection of the elemental microcosm of the embodied magician with the elemental macrocosm of the environment through the representation of the pentagram. In essence, this encapsulates the process of further magical operations, and this centrality leads to it being performed as a prerequisite to almost all rituals in Golden Dawn practice. The LBRP functions to set a space apart as sacred and thus suitable for ritual by creating an environment which spatializes the elements through movements of the magician's body. Because the pentagram can symbolize the elements at both a macrocosmic and microcosmic level, it is suitable for the creation of this liminal space between microcosm and macrocosm. Therefore, this mesocosmic ritual space acts to contract the vastness of the macrocosm while at the same time being a reflection of the elemental makeup of the embodied magician which acts within this space, therefore also acting to expand the microcosm. This ritual space is created through the act of drawing a magic circle and 4 pentagrams. Beginning in the east, the practitioner walks the circumference of the circle and draws pentagrams at each of the cardinal directions with full-bodied gestures. These are drawn in specific ways to signify different meanings of the pentagrams. Significantly, this shows that the meaning of the pentagram is not static and merely represented through drawing, but rather what it represents emerges through the action of drawing the representation. Both the circle and the pentagrams are visualized or optically imagined in external space as beams of white or blue flaming light. After drawing each of the pentagrams, one intones various 4-lettered names of God at each of the directions. This first section serves to demarcate a ritual space by drawing a circle, as well as to banish any unwanted entities which might impede the operation through the drawing of the pentagram and the intonation of the God names, with the circle acting as a strict boundary which they may not cross. After completing the circle and the pentagrams, the practitioner stands in the center, representing the 5th element of spirit, and invokes 4 archangels from each of the cardinal directions into the ritual space, thus corresponding them with the 4 elements. This second section serves to invoke desired entities into the space which may assist the operation, with the circle acting as a porous boundary which they may move between. Given all of this, what cognitive processes might be involved in this ritual? One of the most fundamental aspects of embodied knowledge is that which is required to navigate the body through space. Due to the primacy of this embodied knowledge, it is easily applied to other domains through the same conceptual mapping process found in conceptual metaphors. This conceptual spatialization can be found abundantly in visual depictions of information, such as flowcharts and diagrams. It may also take concrete forms, such as the architecture of the humanities building at UCD, which spatializes disciplines vertically according to their abstractness. Conceptual spatialization can also be found abundantly in esoteric diagrams. The reason for its prevalence across various contexts is that it is an incredibly simple and efficient way of navigating and communicating complex concepts. With this in mind, how might the practice of spatializing the four elements to the cardinal directions in the LBRP engage this implicit knowledge? Given that this practice seeks to unite the elements in the microcosmic body and the macrocosmic world via the body's movement through the world, we would do well to look at the physiology of human bodily movement. Our body affords movement along four primary directions, front, back, left, and right, along which the central trunk of the body moves. The four cardinal directions are then a consequence of mapping these directions of bodily movement onto the world in which one moves. Thus, the quaternary of these directions of movement are then conceptually mapped to the four elements, with the uniting fifth element of spirit mapped onto the uniting mover of the central trunk of the body. This illustrates a multifaceted example of conceptual spatialization, with the elements mapped onto the axes of movement in both body and world. The complexity increases when we observe that the pentagram is corresponded with both the elements in the macrocosmic environment, and thus is mapped to the cardinal directions, as well as the microcosmic body, and thus is mapped to the primary axes of bodily movement. This combined pentagrammic representation of macrocosmic and microcosmic elements and the use of bodily and environmental spatial knowledge facilitates the bridging required to build the mesocosm of the ritual space and bridge knowledge into the realm of lived experience. In this, we can observe a spatially extended engagement with the elements through the pentagram built upon its conceptual association with the microcosmic body and macrocosmic environment, exhibiting a sophisticated combination of conceptual metaphors and spatially extended cognition. This spatialization process, utilizing knowledge of moving through the environment, not only allows one to better navigate the abstract concepts of the elements, it quite literally creates an environment in the process. Remembering that a primary function of the LBRP is to establish the magician's ritual world through actions of the body, we can observe a resonance with enactive sense-making's proposal that an organism's world is not pre-given, but rather must be enacted into being. The theory further proposes that it is through this mutually shaping world creation process that we make sense of the environment. So, by creating a ritual environment that spatializes the elements in line with the spatialization of the body, the magician constructs a magical world which they are capable of making sense of. Therefore, the LBRP also illustrates a clear form of enactive sense-making of the elements and the wider magical worldview in which they are embedded. In exhibiting qualities of both extended mind and enactive sense-making theories, the LBRP combines seemingly contrasting outlooks on cognition. Let us first examine representations. By taking abstract knowledge of the elements embedded in text and spatially extending them into the external world through the representation of the pentagram, this practice exhibits a form of extended cognition. Given that the representation's meaning changes depending on the way it is enacted, seen in the specific quality of the drawing gesture changing the meaning of the pentagram, this also exhibits a clear form of enactive sense-making. Yet, due to the visualization practice, the pentagram still stands as an external and thus distinguished representation, which corresponds to the abstract conceptions of the elements held within the magician, mirroring the view of computationalism and extended mind. Thus, seemingly paradoxically, this practice engages both emergent and distinct stances on representation. The pattern of blending frameworks continues when we look at the quality of the boundary between organism and environment from which these differing conceptions of representation arise. The strict boundary of the circle, which protects from unwanted entities, is reminiscent of the strict boundary between organism and environment found in extended mind in computationalist theories. At the same time, the porousness of the boundary, which allows for beneficial archangels to be invoked into the circle, reflects the porous boundary seen in enacted sensemaking. Taken together, this illustrates that the LBRP not only acts as a ritual bridge between micro and macrocosm, but may also help to build a mesocosm between seemingly contrasting views of cognition. By manifesting a ritual world through the action of an embodied magician, not only does this practice represent the wider rationality of Golden Dawn magic, but also acts as a direct presentation of this rationale to the practitioner through their lived enactment of it. Through its use of various strategies of knowledge transmission and exploration, the LBRP serves as a prime example of the complex cognitive processes at work in ritual magic. In its blending of action and representation, microcosmic body and macrocosmic environment, one magic circle in four elemental directions, this practice of performing pentagrams enacts into sense the mesocosmic rationality which is at the core of Golden Dawn magic. Through an analysis of the processes articulated by extended mind, enactive sense making, and conceptual metaphor theories, we can observe how ideas from cognitive science can help to illuminate the ways in which these practices employ various cognitive mechanisms in very rational ways. Yet, at the same time, through its blending of abstract conceptual representations and concrete actions of the body, the study of these practices also offers critical contributions to debates within cognitive science. By elucidating examples of how various approaches can be creatively combined, investigation of esoteric practices may help to provide invaluable opportunities for research which bridge methodological gaps in cognitive science. This is nothing new, as the admitted embedded quality of cognition has made scholars of the humanities crucial to the pursuits of 4E cognitive science since the start. Yet, given that the investigations of scholars in the humanities involve cognitive agents, their analysis too will be incomplete without reference to scholars exploring the cognitive processes with which they are entangled. Therefore, collaboration between the study of esotericism and cognitive science must be a symbiotic one, informing both without reducing the object of study to either, and, with luck, fostering a spirit of creative exchange along the way. Thank you.